And now, stand-up community subscribers and listeners from around the globe, it's time to Stand Up with Pete Dominic, where we ask the important questions that impact you, your family, and your community. Such as, do these cargo pants make me look even more like a bipedal manatee? And could this be the day I finally see Hamilton and also catch COVID? And now, the podcast host who will gladly help you completely screw up your latest home improvement project, Pete Dominic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And welcome to today's episode of Stand Up with Pete Dominic Daily. Joining me today, two excellent guests, Clint Watts on ransomware, on the Senate investigation into January 6th, and more, including his nonverbal autistic daughter, who he's written a lot about. Great conversation with Clint Watts, and welcoming the great Christine Romans back to the show. She is chief business correspondent over at CNN and co-host of their early morning news program, Early Start. Used to be a regular on the show and hasn't joined in a while back on the old show. And I'm very happy to get her on. We had a great conversation about all things jobs, employment. Do employees have the upper hand finally? That's one of many issues I discuss with Christine. Clint Watts, Christine Romans, both coming up. Very happy to have you joining me here on today's episode. Hey, if you haven't written a review yet on Apple Podcasts, please do. Cormac05 says, I've been listening to Pete Dominic from his earliest shows on the SiriusXM POTUS channel, following him around his various locales on that platform, and ultimately to his current iteration as a podcast. His guests are always insightful and interesting, and Pete approaches his conversations with them seriously, but with a wonderful dose of humor, since he is a stand-up comic by trade. This show is just a wonderful exploration of a wide variety of topics and current events that hold actual relevance in today's world. I've started my day for many years listening to this show and plan for many more. Cormac05, you are the best. Write a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you for the 5 stars. And go do that now. Appreciate those of you who start the day or spend any of your day with me here and any of your night as well. Tonight, we will hang out. It's normally Thursdays at 8, but I am off to a big high school reunion this weekend. A bunch of my buddies very much looking forward to Stang Bang. Our mascot was the Mustang. Stang Bang this weekend. We are so amped up for that, me and my pals. It's going to be a great, great time. But we're going to meet tonight, you and I, Wednesday at 8 p.m. East. And you can get the link to our meeting if you are a Stand Up with Pete Dominic subscriber to our community. So please sign up now if you haven't already. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. Go to the paid subscription link in the show notes. But let's get started with the news, shall we? It's time to look back at the last 24 hours in news. Let's do it. Okay, one big story got a lot of attention today. I talk about it with Clint Watts coming up, is that the 127-page joint report from the Senate dropped. It's the most comprehensive and detailed account to date on the intelligence, communications, and policing failures around the Capitol riot, but of course it was very controversial because Republicans wouldn't allow certain words to be used, like insurrection or anything that connected Donald Trump to it. So you still need a bigger commission like the 9/11 Commission. Anyway, here is dumb Mitch McConnell talking about it briefly, and then I'll get you some reaction to it as well.
Today's report is one of the many reasons I'm confident in the ability of existing investigations to uncover all actionable facts about the events of January 6th. I'll continue to support these efforts over any that seek to politicize the process, and I would urge my colleagues to do the same.
Oh, you don't care about anything, do you? Nothing at all. But here is Congressman Jim Himes. He was on MSNBC. Here's his reaction to it.
Well, where Mitch McConnell is wrong, because there are other investigations going on, there are hundreds of prosecutions going on. Where Mitch McConnell is dead wrong is that there's two critical pieces here that we won't get at anytime soon without a January 6th commission. One, of course, is exactly how Donald Trump and associated people, and I don't know who associated people are because we don't have a commission issuing subpoenas and getting to that, how they helped spark, how they drove, as Director Director Brennan said, what happened on January 6th. We need to better understand that. The other piece that is not going to come up necessarily unless we really look hard at it, and this is a clear and present danger to the Republic today, is how is it that there are still tens of millions of Americans who believe that Donald Trump was denied the election, despite the fact that there is not a fact, not one fact that substantiates that belief. There are tens of millions of Americans who today believe that the president is illegitimate. And there are people, I'm telling you, including some in this building, who understand the power of that big lie and who are just waiting to take advantage of it for their own electoral purposes.
All right, that's Democratic Congressman Jim Himes reacting to stupid Mitch McConnell. And now here is Democratic Senator Gary Peters from Michigan, also on MSNBC, with reaction to this. He's the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, so he has a lot to say about it. And he's got a nice tight beard as well, I noticed.
This report in no way whatsoever, and it was never intended to be a complete commission report that looked at all aspects of this attack, including what led to it, what motivated folks to come to the Capitol. And, we know from open sources, we have the former President Trump talking about how it's going to be wild and how he put out his false accusations about the election. Those were all false statements. It was stop the steal. It was clear he was sending folks there to try to stop the counting of the votes, which in my mind is an insurrection, is what he was fostering. But we were focused just on the actual security breaches that occurred on that day. It was meant to be limited in scope. We need to do a whole lot more. We have to ask a whole lot more questions, and we have to get a whole lot more answers. That's why I'm so disappointed we don't have the commission. But certainly other committees need to start picking this up as well. If we look back at 9/11, before the commission went forward, there are actually a large number of investigations done by a variety of committees in the Congress. I certainly hope we can continue to have those investigations. We can't be done. As I mentioned at the top of this interview, my committee, as chair of Homeland Security, we are looking into the rise of violent extremist groups, domestic terrorism, which is a significant, in fact, the most worrisome terrorist threat to our homeland is domestic. It's not foreign. And we certainly saw elements of that on January 6th. And we have to treat this threat with the seriousness that it deserves. We are not giving up when it comes to continuing to look at what is behind this rise of domestic terrorism that we've seen recently.
All right, that's Senator Gary Peters. And now let's listen to the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, also on the report that came out today.
Now, on January 6th, this morning, the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, in partnership with the Rules Committee, released a joint report related to the aspects of the tragedy of January 6th. I particularly salute Chairs Peters and Klobuchar for the good work they have done with their ranking members. The report drew a few notable conclusions, especially with respect to failures in intelligence gathering and communication that took place on and before January the 6th. But just as glaring is what the report didn't consider. Indeed, what was not allowed, it was not allowed to consider. The report did not investigate, report on, or hardly make any reference to the actual cause, the actual impetus for the attack on January the 6th. With the exception of a brief reference to former President Trump's remarks at the Ellipse, Senate Republicans insisted that the report exclude anything having to do with the cause of the insurrection. If anything, the joint report by the Homeland Security and Rules Committees has strengthened the argument for an independent commission on January the 6th. We had a perfect opportunity to establish such a commission at the end of last session, before Republicans mounted a partisan filibuster against it. Despite the fact that the Democrats worked with Republicans for weeks in the House and Senate to construct a commission that was bipartisan, focused, straight down the middle. Despite the fact that Speaker Pelosi acceded to every major request made by House Republicans about the structure of the commission. And despite the fact that here in the Senate, I have supported the changes proposed by my colleague, Senator Collins. As the big lie continues to spread, as faith in our elections continues to decline, it is crucial we establish a trusted, independent record of what transpired on January 6th and what caused it. So I reserve the right to bring legislation for an independent, bipartisan commission to the Senate floor for another vote.
So I guess they're going to give it another shot so they can fail again. And progressives and Democrats around the country are feeling pretty frustrated right now with both Democrats and the Senate and the Biden administration. We could talk about that. But President Biden ended negotiations with a group of Republicans led by Republican from West Virginia, Shelley Moore Capito, over his infrastructure package Tuesday as the two sides failed to strike a deal after weeks of talks. And I think just file that under nobody's surprised at all. But here is more from the turtle, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, on this.
As you look to what the Majority Leader has in mind for June, it's pretty clear the era of bipartisanship is over. We passed 6 bills so far this year, significant bills on a bipartisan basis. Bills that came out of committee that had buy-in from both sides. But I think that's coming to a screeching halt.
But don't worry about it. Chuck Schumer's got it all under control. Here he is talking to reporters yesterday.
Well, look, we're pursuing a two-path proposal. On the one hand, there's bipartisan negotiations, and those are continuing. The first were between President Biden and Senator Capito with just Republicans. Those seem to be running into a brick wall. But a bipartisan group led by Senator Sinema and I think Senator Portman is the lead Republican, are trying to put something together that might be closer to what the president needs. And so that's good. But that's not going to be the only answer. We all know as a caucus we will not be able to do all the things that the country needs in a bipartisan way. And so at the same time, we are pursuing the pursuit of reconciliation. And that is going on at the same time. And it may well be that part of the bill that will pass will be bipartisan and part of it will be through reconciliation. But we're not going to sacrifice the bigness and boldness in this bill. We will just pursue two paths, and at some point they will join.
All right, so a lot more on that, of course, to come. But here's the other big headline that a lot of folks were discussing and outraged by yesterday. Biden Justice Department seeks to defend Trump in suit over rape denial. Yeah, that's the headline at the New York Times. Donald Trump facing a defamation lawsuit brought by E. Jean Carroll, who accused Mr. Trump of raping her. For more, here's NBC News' Pete Williams, Justice Correspondent, explaining it all.
Well, this is one of those times when the Justice Department is taking a position defending the government's interest and protecting federal employees from lawsuits, even though it does mean taking the side of the former president. So this is what this is about. In 2019, after New York writer Jean Carroll accused Donald Trump of raping her in a department store in the 1990s, he made a series of statements while he was in the White House denying that it was happening, that it happened, and accusing her of lying. He even said, quote, "She's not my type." In response, she sued him for libel. And then last year, the Trump Justice Department moved to block her suit, arguing that a federal law protects federal employees from this kind of lawsuit. A New York judge disagreed. He said the suit could continue. And then, as you note, last night, the Biden Justice Department appealed that ruling. Now, the appeal repeatedly says it's not defending what the former president did or what it calls his crude and disrespectful comments, but it says presidents are covered by this federal shield law and that the law covers what they do that's within the scope of their official duties. And it says speaking to the press and public about issues that touch on their fitness for office is part of their duties. And it cites several similar cases in which the government took the same position with other officials. Now, Jean Carroll is blasting this latest filing. She says this, quote, "As women across the country are standing up and holding men accountable for assault, the DOJ is trying to stop me from having the same right."
All right, thank you, Pete Williams and NBC News. Why is Merrick Garland's Department of Justice carrying water for Bill Barr? That's the question that my friend Elie Mystal answered in The Nation magazine. He writes, one answer is that Garland, like many Biden officials, is a, quote, institutionalist, more committed to preserving institutions than fighting hard political fights, but then goes on to argue, how do you preserve the institution if you don't have any accountability for the previous attorney general, who was the most corrupt attorney general in the history of attorney generals and Department of Justice? Well, For more on this and reaction, let me go to Elie Honig. He is a former state and federal prosecutor, CNN contributor. He was on yesterday on CNN with Poppy Harlow and Jim Sciutto, and here is his opinion on this.
Yeah, I think Bill Barr was wrong then. I think Merrick Garland is wrong now, and I'm not alone. The federal district court judge who heard this case, Lewis Kaplan in the Southern District of New York, also found that Bill Barr was wrong. Now the case is being appealed. Now the law basically says DOJ will step in and take over a case if the lawsuit relates to an official's official duties. If you're talking about the president, for example, if the president gets sued personally for signing a piece of legislation or issuing an executive order, that falls within his duties. DOJ takes over. Here, I disagree, and Judge Kaplan disagreed, that defaming somebody, calling somebody a liar who accused the president of sexual assault, I disagree that that falls within a president's official duties.
So, Elie, you have the legal argument there, which you know far better than me, but you have the political argument here, right? Because Barr was criticized he was accused of basically using the Justice Department to defend the president, right? Kind of using the DOJ as his own personal lawyer. Here you have the odd circumstances where the new Attorney General is, in effect, defying the current president, President Biden, who has publicly said he does not support that. So from a policy perspective, who has it right?
Yeah, I think Merrick Garland is making a mistake here, and I think this is a missed opportunity. I think it's good that Merrick Garland is making this decision without consulting with President Biden. That's as it should be. The Attorney General should not be taking orders from the president, but I think he's missed an opportunity here to draw a line between the new DOJ and the Bill Barr DOJ. Merrick Garland has been, I believe, timid in his approach to this issue and others. We saw the decision to appeal a separate ruling last week or a few weeks ago relating to the obstruction of justice issue on the Mueller report. And Garland really, the polite way to put it is he's being an institutionalist. I don't subscribe to that. I think he's failing to rise to the challenge that meets him as a result of taking over from Bill Barr and the corruption that Barr put on the Justice Department.
There you go. That's one analysis. There's a lot of different interpretations of what's going on. That's Elie Honig on CNN. Going back to Elie Mystal, what's with everybody named Elie? That doesn't make any sense. Why have I done this to you? Elie Mystal writes in his piece at The Nation, this kind of institutionalist response, of course, precisely what Barr and Trump and the rest of the GOP always banks on. They know they can commit crimes with impunity while in power because they know that Democrats will never go after them when their party is back in control. They know they can destroy whatever institution they run because they know that Democrats will waste all their time trying to rebuild the institution instead of capitalizing on their power. They know they can deface the country because the Democrats will always be there trying to wash away the mess instead of prosecuting the vandals. If you long for a return to institutional competence, the Biden administration is doing just fine. The COVID-19 vaccine is being distributed, corruption and graft are being reined in, and our government is being guided by the perceived interests of the American people, as opposed to the vindictive thought bubbles of Twitter carnival barker. The institutions are making a comeback, and with them, a shared sense of normalcy is also returning. For some, that's all they wanted out of the Democrats. Others wanted justice. Elie Mystal in The Nation magazine. Oh, and you got to read his recent piece on Joe Manchin. And let me give you one more take on this from law school professor, Obama, U.S. attorney, 25-year federal prosecutor, Joyce Vance, who was also on MSNBC, where she had this to say to Nicole Wallace yesterday.
Well, Merrick Garland was always fated to be the most hated man in America within a couple of months of becoming Attorney General. It's a thankless job in the best of times, and these are not the best of times. So what's happening here is DOJ is actually seeking to substitute itself in the lawsuit in place of the former president. And presumably that would end the case because the federal government is immune from being sued for defamation, and these are claims in defamation. The problem here is E. Jean Carroll gets no remedy and the lawsuit is over if the Second Circuit permits Garland and DOJ to essentially become Trump in this case. But, you know, that's not to say that DOJ is representing Trump in the same way that Barr did. They're critical of him. They call what he said about Carroll crude and disrespectful. Trump is certainly going to find a lot to criticize in DOJ's, quote, representation of him. So it's a nuanced situation. Ultimately, Nicole, I think the bottom line is this. For DOJ to represent Trump here. They have to say that his comments about E. Jean Carroll were within the scope of his duties as president. That's a bad argument. It's a wrong argument on the law. The district judge held that that wasn't the case. Ultimately, I think, although DOJ made this decision for the right reasons, it's the wrong decision to continue this representation.
All right, there are several perspectives on that, and I just noticed one more. I'm not going to have time to get it, but Dan Abrams actually agrees with this decision. So I'm going to try to give you as much perspective as I can on these important issues using sound, because that's what this is, a daily podcast. Always appreciate anything you send me, any thoughts, any clips, anything you want to send me, and people do that all day. So send it my way. DM me on Twitter or email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. This is our show, and you can help produce it each and every day. So let me move on and to the other big issue, which is Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia. Yeah, we got to keep talking about him. And last night on All In and Chris Hayes, he welcomed Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on to give a perspective on why Joe Manchin is voting against the interests of his own supporters. Overwhelmingly, people in West Virginia want him to vote for this piece of legislation, and he's not. Why not? Well, here is AOC on a perspective I think we're not hearing as much or enough about. Hint, hint, it's the money.
But, I do think on that note of political preservation, one thing that is not being discussed about, and I do think it should be talked about more, is the fact that H.R. 1 is one of the most assertive bills that we have to tackle dark money in politics. And so there are two very key components in H.R. 1 in the For the People Act. One is a forceful and very strong provisions and laws to combat outright voter suppression. And these are proposals, and if passed, it would essentially preempt changes to state law. So it would protect people's actual right to vote. But the other aspect of this is that H.R. 1 stands up against lobbyists and dark money. And I would reckon to think that this is probably just as much a part of Joe Manchin's calculus as anything else. Because when it comes to this bipartisan argument, I got to tell you, I don't buy it. Because Joe Manchin has voted for bills that have not been bipartisan before. Look at the American Rescue Plan. So this is not just about bipartisanship. This is, I think, because you look at the Koch brothers and you look at organizations like the Heritage Foundation and conservative lobby groups that are doing a victory lap, claiming victory over the fact that Manchin refuses to change on the filibuster. And I think that these two things are very closely intertwined. And I think that there's a desire to make this just about protecting the franchise, but protecting our democracy is also about making sure that we give lobbyists and dark money groups, which are funding these attacks on the right to vote, the boot. But, corporate money has a very, very tight grip on both parties. And I think that has to do with the calculus in this situation that people aren't really discussing enough.
God damn, is she smart. Man, is she smart. And yes, that's the thing. People are trying to understand this. You're never going to get them to admit that. But that's the thing. Oh, man, so good. And I want to play a little more for you from Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, because she had a little friendly fire against the vice president, Kamala Harris, who's in a tight spot as she's getting a lot of criticism for her handling or mishandling of all things immigration. I think that's all preposterous. I mean, I have a lot of problems with it because of the argument that I make to Christine Romans about immigration when we're talking about economics, and that's coming up. So I don't want to make it twice on the show. I've made it many, many times before. But anyway, yesterday I played on this podcast the clip of Kamala Harris saying, "Don't come to America," a couple of times. And she got a good amount of criticism, and I was tongue-in-cheek criticizing her again because yesterday on the podcast, because she's basically pulling up the welcome mat to these people whose situation we contributed to. And that's the point that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is making in this clip again on MSNBC with Chris Hayes last night. I thought this was really interesting, and I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's very long. She talked for I want to say 5 minutes straight, but I'll play a couple minutes where you get the idea, and you can watch it or listen to it on Chris Hayes' All In podcast if you want. Let's start it with those comments from the vice president in Guatemala on Monday.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come.
You tweeted some criticism of that, and I guess just to give the sort of defense of it and get your reaction to it, right? I mean, I think the thing that people in the administration would say, or others, is that, look, it really is a very dangerous journey. It can be awful for the people that undertake it, and you want to kind of not create an incentive structure that creates more of traffic in these corridors that can be so dangerous. What's your problem with her phrasing it that way?
Well, I think the issue here, and first of all, I think this is not just about the vice president. This is about the Biden administration's immigration policy writ large is not working. It's wrong and it's inhumane. It's rooted and he inherited it, but frankly, this was also a problem not just inherited by Donald Trump, but inherited by Barack Obama, all the way back to the creation of DHS and ICE under George Bush. But I think one of the issues here in saying that is that Guatemalans and Central American and South American immigrants know that this journey is dangerous. This is not something that is lost on them, and this is not something that I think we need to inform them of. They take that journey knowing that they may die. And the reason they or anybody would take a journey knowing that they may die is the same reason why a person who is stuck in a burning building may elect to jump out a window, because they know that their conditions back home in Guatemala, there are femicides that are happening throughout Central and South America. And there's a great deal of political violence, et cetera. And people leave because they believe that they have a greater chance of being targeted, killed, and murdered if they stay than the odds of them being killed if they go on that journey.
I'm telling you, that woman is smart, and I think that she's going to run for president one day if we still have a democracy, which is a good chance that we apparently won't. But don't give up. Don't ever give up. Okay, finally, I want to play for you the intellectual opposite of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the U.S. House of Representatives. She represents a district in Georgia. Her name is Marjorie Greene Taylor, and you've heard way too much about her, and she actually has pursued and really harassed AOC and trying to get her to debate her. And it's, credit to Alexandria, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, for not taking the bait, and I think taking the high road when it comes to Marjorie Taylor Greene. But Marjorie Taylor Greene was on Steve Bannon's show, and she basically doesn't have any idea, obviously, about science and viruses, and she believes all kinds of conspiracy theories. And you know what else she doesn't believe in? Evolution. What a surprise. Listen to this beautiful nugget of intellectualism.
That makes people sick, spreads so quick, and kills people. There's no other intent, but it's a bioweapon. And then our American—
You don't buy— hold on. Hang on. You don't buy the argument that say, hey, the gain of function is all because we got to take these viruses and we got to power them up to look for vaccines and to look for other solutions in case somehow they come up with this. You don't buy the logic of that. Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't buy it because I don't believe in evolution. I don't believe in that type of so-called science. I don't believe in evolution. I believe in God. And there's these viruses were not making people sick until they created them and made them into weaponize these viruses to be able to attach to our cells and make us sick. This has caused so many people to die all over the world. This is a bioweapon. People can call it whatever they can for research and to create, vaccinations, but there's no need for a vaccine if the virus doesn't make the human population sick to begin with. So
okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to have to ask you to leave. I'm sorry. You've had way too much to drink. This is an Arby's, ma'am, I have no idea what you're talking about. We can get you a sandwich and some fries, but we can't help you with the nonsense. That's where I'll have to leave the last 24 in terms of sound, but there's a lot more news, and I'm going to give as many stories as I can, rapid-fire style, right now to you in a news dump.
Stampeding herd of cows over hills and stumps. Your friend is underfoot on today's news dump.
Oh, no. Oh, no, my buddy is under those cows. Wait, stop. We can't leave him there alone. What, did I just become Seinfeld? Wait, stop. My friend is under those cows.
Thank you, Pete Co, for another beautiful, weird jingle. All right, let's start the news dump with the fact that yesterday the internet was broken for a little while, or it was down. At least a bunch of high-traffic websites were ranging from news outlets to social media platforms, suffering simultaneous global outrages. People were outraged by the outages, is what I meant to say, early yesterday morning. Most of the websites impacted were back up and running after the temporary hit, and the issues were linked to a cloud computing company called Fastly. That's a great name for a cloud computing company, Fastly. The company did not disclose the cause of the outage, but people are got to be pretty angry at Fastly right now and their stupid name. Okay, so a big story yesterday, another huge story came from ProPublica, where they say that many of the richest Americans pay next to no income tax. So that created a lot of problems. I'll be talking with experts about that. But the richest 25 Americans pay less in tax, 15.8% of adjusted gross income, than many ordinary workers do. Once you include taxes for Social Security and Medicare, again, the nonprofit investigative journalism organization ProPublica got this with, I think it was a leak of taxes from the IRS or something like that. I definitely want to learn a lot more about that. A kayaker was rescued 6 days into his California to Hawaii attempt. He was rescued yesterday by the Coast Guard. He planned a 70-day solo voyage from California to Hawaii, but he had to give up 6 days in because apparently the 44-year-old Frenchman was having trouble in the rough seas and high winds, and problems with his sea anchor made it impossible to eat, drink, sleep, or communicate easily with his support team. What a surprise. Crazy motherfucker. All right, speaking of, this is a wild story yesterday. I woke up and saw this video in the morning. A man in France slapped the shit out of the French president. Man, he slapped him hard. Did you see that? Man, 2 people were arrested after a man slapped the French president as he was approaching a small crowd, prompting condemnation of the attack across the political spectrum. I mean, that was America. He had 15 holes in him, no matter what color he is, I think. But you got to see this video. There's a bunch of different versions of it. But, yeah, the President Macron got the shit slapped out of him. Isn't that just like a Frenchman get the opportunity to punch a politician, he ends up open-hand slapping him? I made that joke on Twitter, and, French people got upset. Sorry, French people. All right, the Senate approved a sprawling $250 billion bill to curtail China's economic and military ambitions. A bill adopted on a bipartisan vote invests heavily in U.S. science and technology while threatening a host of punishments against Beijing. I think that got undercovered yesterday. In Florida, I'll take you there now. High school temporarily halted distribution of a student-run yearbook amid concerns over pages that documented the Black Lives Matter movement from the past year. Apparently, the white parents in this Florida high school were pissed because they didn't also include a section on Blue Lives Matter, which is, when I hear that, I just hear white supremacists. Everybody knows Blue Lives Matter. There's no question about it that Blue Lives Matter. They're police officers and people, don't get me started on that one. Okay, and here's a good story. How about this? Record high 70% of Americans are now supporting same-sex marriage. Majority of Republicans even now support same-sex marriage, and support among older adults has reached the 60% mark. And that's great news. And now for 2 crazy animal stories, and I don't know which one you want to pick. Let's do this one. A bunch of people there's this video and pictures from people in Florida on boats. I guess the story is from last month, but it just got documented yesterday at the U.S. Sun is where I saw it. And there were a whole bunch of hammerhead sharks circling them. So would you rather have hammerhead sharks circling you when you're on a raft, or what happened to this other girl, twin sisters, as a matter of fact, in Mexico, where one of them was pulled into the water by a crocodile, and the other girl slapped the shit out of that crocodile like she was the French president, like 3 times, to save her twin sister from being, quote, thrown around like a rag doll. British backpacker has been hailed a super badass after saving her identical sister from a crocodile's jaws by punching it in the face 3 times. So, I don't know. That's a good way to end today's news dump. How about that? All right.
Today's show is sponsored by Indeed.com, which I'm really excited about because I'm continuing my sponsorship with them because so many people have benefited from Indeed.com, including longtime listener Frank Zarinsky, who I just got to read you this email from him about Indeed and how his company, he's a listener, benefited from this. Frank wrote to me and said, Pete, I want to share with you how excited we are to hear that Indeed is a sponsor of your show now, because after we hired everyone that matched our culture and vision at Motion City Media, that's Frank's company, from within our network, Indeed has been the only career search website that we trust and are now using on a recurring basis. We've had a tremendous amount of success finding candidates through Indeed that lined up nicely to job postings without having to sort through endless resumes. Some of our hires from Indeed have been absolute gems. Steven is one of our client service specialists for studio support as an employee and also is one of our most requested real estate photographers. He's super kind, accountable, and a perfect fit at Motion City Media, basically hand-delivered by Indeed.com. Although we run some posts with no ad budget at all, you really see a much larger volume of quality candidates when you promote your listing. The ad dollars go a long way. We often have to end the campaign early because we find our matches in a very short time. How's about that? You know, they give you the copy to read, any company, if you're going to be doing an ad on your podcast or wherever. But I didn't even need to read it because we've got Frank's testimonial. Indeed is the job site that makes hiring easy as 1, 2, 3, post, screen, and interview all on Indeed. Get started right now, folks, with a free $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/standup. Get a $75 credit right now at Indeed.com/standup. Indeed.com/standup. This offer is valid through June 30th. Terms and conditions do apply. Frank, thank you very much for listening and for sending me that. That's awesome. So much better than anything else I could have read, and I'm happy it's working out for you. All right, go to Indeed.com/standup, and they're my sponsor, so go now. Thank you very much. And I can't do it without your support, so if you haven't subscribed yet, please go to Patreon.com/Pete Dominic, or just click on the paid subscription link in the show notes and sign up to support this independent podcast. Okay.
Time now to get to my first guest who has not joined me in quite some time. She's CNN's chief business correspondent. She's also the co-anchor of Early Start with Laura Jarrett, weekdays 4 to 6 a.m. She's an Emmy Award winner. She is an author. She is a really good friend of mine, CNN's explainer-in-chief of all things money. I always love when I get to chat with Christine Romans. It's been far too long, and here go find her on Twitter at Christine Romans. Here we go. Hi, Christine Romans.
Hi, Pete Dominic.
I'm so glad that you are talking, that I'm getting to talk to you, and that you are back to, I guess, normal life in studio, yeah?
I have been in studio from the whole time.
Oh, wait, what?
Yeah. I have done this commute every day. It's been so quiet, but now people are starting to come back now. So I'm actually on the set with Laura Jarrett now, and we're out of our little flash cams, and we're doing our show. So it's exciting.
I guess I didn't realize that, but that is very interesting to hear. And now you guys are together. How have you been? We haven't talked in a while. How has your year been? How are you doing?
You know, what a journey, right? Everything's fine. I mean, I got a lot of quality time with my kids. I'm not going to lie. I have 3 sons, and not having to go to 15 birthday parties over the past year is kind of fun.
I am glad that I don't have kids that do travel sports or travel anything. And I don't know how these parents who have kids that they fully support their sport like take their whole weekend and go to a basketball tournament. I have such a hard time with that. Do you? I mean, you work so hard. Do you do that? Do you like take weekends and support your kids' activities, your free time?
So we have a swimmer and two soccer guys, and so there's a lot of running around. But we don't usually do. And this past year, there haven't been big tournaments and stuff like that. There's only like one of those, so it's not too bad. But one of my sisters-in-law, brother and sister-in-law, they have 5 boys, and all of them were water polo and swimming, and they basically lived in a musty van, driving their kids around.
Yeah, I mean, some people love it, so fine. I'm just projecting. I don't know. I have a hard time watching folks take off on the weekend when they work all week. I wanted to talk with you about a number of things, obviously economics and the job market, and I wanted to just start by asking you what you think of what's happening, what the larger trends are. But, how did we make it through that year, this past year, in terms of work and life and so many different changes? What are your broader thoughts on what we've witnessed over the last year in terms of work?
First, I'll say that Congress, I can't believe I'm saying this, Congress got it kind of right. They knew early on in the early days of the pandemic that this was going to be devastating on the American workforce and that you had to get money to people. And so they did. And that has created this opportunity that I don't think I've ever seen before. For the first time in some workers' lifetimes, they're getting a living wage between the stimulus checks and unemployment benefits and sort of just the cash flowing from Congress to keep the economy afloat. And it's giving them some breathing space to decide what they want to do. I'm watching retailers and restaurant chains raising wages and now offering $1,000 signing bonuses because they're trying to get these workers back into the labor market. And these workers, many, many workers, are essentially saying, wait a minute, everyone wants to get back to quote unquote normal, but we didn't really like normal. Normal was an army of low-wage workers working 2+ jobs for a full-time wage without good childcare and without good, scheduling, without really any backstops. And so you've had a year where you've paused the student loan payments, where you've paused the, there's been a moratorium on evictions, where money has flowed to keep people afloat. And workers, for the first time in my life, I think, have the upper hand. So that's been a really big change, I think, Pete.
I think for you to say, for the first time in my life, workers have the upper hand is a huge statement. And that is the trend we're seeing. You're not the only person who covers these issues, an expert on economics and finance, saying this. Lots of folks are saying the first time in our life, because we're around the same age, that workers have the upper hand. That's why. Why is that happening? I mean, you just said a little bit of why it's happening, but is it a real thing? Is it temporary? Why?
I don't know if it's temporary. I will say that you're going to have these child tax credits that are going to start to flow directly into people's bank accounts starting in July. So now the unemployment benefits will wind down. The extra $300 a week in unemployment benefits will wind down. And these child tax credits are going to be start to be direct deposited. So the goal here is to cut child poverty in half. And Congress has now paid for that. So that's going to be another bit of breathing space for working families. I'm thinking of these low-wage frontline workers who are trying to decide between taking care of grandma and their aunt and their kids and going back to the weird scheduling of 2 different part-time jobs. And now they have some breathing space. I know we've seen these studies that show that many of these restaurant workers and some frontline workers have taken the last year and taken these resources of the last year to retrain for jobs in finance and tech, higher paying jobs in finance and tech. So some people have been investing in themselves and their career. And that's one of the reasons why you're hearing about these worker shortages on frontline jobs. I don't know if it's going to be permanent. I know that there's been 25 Republican-led state governments that have pulled the extra jobless benefits because they say it's a disincentive for going back to work. I'll be really interested to see if that does nudge people off the sidelines. Pete, the San Francisco Fed did a really interesting study about the extra jobless benefits and found that for example, if 28 jobless workers, for every 28 jobless workers, 7 would be offered a job back. 1 of those 7 would decline the job because the extra jobless benefits. So it's a very small group of people who aren't working because they're getting paid to not work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There are other reasons people don't want to go back right now. And I do think that kids out of school, health considerations for your family, just the trauma of the last year is plenty of reason for somebody who has a little bit of savings from the last year. They don't have to go to work right now.
Yeah, that's not that easy. You can't minimize it to just one thing. And you citing the research is what I suspected, and I think a lot of people have said that. But it's also weird when these Republican states, in this case, turn away free money. Same thing with the Medicaid expansion. Like the federal government is giving them money in this case, and they're saying no, and they're attributing it because they're saying workers aren't going back to work, where that could be the case with 1 or 2. But if you've got kids at home and it's a minimum wage or low wage job, you're not actually able to make money because you can't put the kids back in any kind of childcare because you can't afford that. And I think a lot of people have learned that as well. Also, let's just talk about the surprising job numbers from April and what, May, how that rebounded. It's not quite the job expansion that experts and economists thought it would be. Why is that? Or what do you think about it?
I think there's no blueprint for how we're going to get out of this and recover. So honestly, and I've talked to a lot of economists, some of them are literally spitballing what they think is going to happen in the next month for jobs numbers, honestly. Because look at what the huge miss. I haven't seen in my 20 years of covering economics that April jobs report. I've never seen a miss that big. Economists just really got it wrong because we've never done this before. We flipped the economy off like a light switch. And now we've flipped it back on and the lights are flickering, right? It's going to take a second for things to catch up. There have been so many weird distortions and disruptions from the past year, and we just got to work through those kinks. And so that, I think, is really natural. I know we're down 7.6 million jobs still since the pandemic began. At the pace of the May jobs report, it's still going to take another 13 or 14 months to get all of those jobs back. I'm hoping we can start to have some stronger jobs growth, later this year once schools open. I'm really hoping once schools open and childcare situations get settled, that will help people to be able to go after those. There are 8 million job openings in America right now that people will be able to match up. But it's also not one for one, Pete. I mean, you and I have talked about this before, the skills mismatch. There are workers who want to work and there are jobs that are open, and sometimes there's not an exact match. So there might be work for us to do there on retraining. And we've got all these jobs in trucking, over the road trucking. We've got all these jobs in skilled manufacturing. You can't necessarily take somebody who is trying to get rid of a dead end restaurant job and retrain them overnight into skilled manufacturing. But maybe that's something we could think of as we're talking about, infrastructure spending, and we're talking about, preparing our workforce for the future.
Yeah, really good. All really good points. Neil Irwin, when crunching the numbers at New York Times, economy writer, journalist, when crunching the numbers on the job numbers that came out, what was it? Was it last Friday?
Yeah, it was Friday.
This past Friday. He wrote in his quick takes, he wrote, here's a weird one. Construction employment down 20,000 in May, mainly due to 17,000 drop in non-residential specialty trade contractors. Despite the housing boom, construction employment still 225,000 below February 2020. Supply constraints are not great, Bob, which is a reference to the movie What About Bob, which I laughed at. But people who are doing any kind of home improvements, and I'm always fiddling around, notice the different prices in supplies for things like lumber, like a 2x4, or that there are shortages in supplies. And we can talk about, as I have on the show, and I'm sure you have a lot, the microchip shortage. So this has a lot to do when it comes to construction, a lack of supply of raw materials or costs of raw materials. Can you help me understand?
Yeah, so imagine, and let's use a real world example. You talked about, puttering around the house. Okay, so you want to put on a pergola.
I built, just to be clear, I built a shed, Christine, and a new garden.
That shed would cost probably 3 times as much today if you had to do it again. But okay, so say you're building a shed, right? And you need help to put in the footings and lay the concrete pad. Well, you're not going to start that project if you can't get the lumber. And you don't have the lumber, so you haven't hired the guy to come out. And, it delays everybody who's working in the business while you're waiting for the materials to come. So that's one of the reasons why you've seen these hiccups in the construction sector. And I'm hopeful that that's going to work its way out. I've been watching lumber futures, and lumber futures have been coming down off their peaks. That's good. Copper prices have been just insane. But again, all of this is because of just the huge behemoth of the American economy and the global economy stopping for the better part of a year and then starting up again. I think we have months ahead of us where we're going to find new disruptions and new little snags. Just today, the White House has announced a task force to really look at 4 areas. Semiconductors, one of them. Agriculture and food is another one. Building and construction is another area where they want to make sure that the U.S. is not so reliant on the global supply chain that we find ourselves, in a point of weakness again, and that we're trying to address that. And that is a made in America push. That's a skilled manufacturing, manufacturing stuff we need in America push. And that's where, ironically, this president and the previous president kind of build it here ideas are pretty similar.
Yeah. Did you see that that ad from the Builders Union in support of Joe Biden?
I did not.
That they made? Oh, it's pretty funny because it kind of went viral because they're cursing the whole time, Christine. but the idea was, build in America, and we can talk about the different approaches to that from a Trump administration to a Biden administration. But what about demographics? What about immigration? We always hear about immigration's effect, good, bad, or it depends on your opinion, I suppose, on employment, and also the demographic trends of birth rates or age, like the boomers aging out and Generation Xers, and that there's not enough people in their 20s to fill certain types of positions and so on. How are demographics affecting the economy and these job numbers?
What you're hearing from the big business lobby is that they need, and the ag lobby, frankly, is that we got to fix a worker problem in this country. And that's going to need to be more immigration, more skilled immigration and more low skilled immigration, just more immigration. And, I was watching today, the Vice President Kamala Harris is meeting with the Mexican president today. She was in Guatemala yesterday, and she told people, do not come here. Do not come to the United States. Stop coming. And what I hear from business leaders is, oh my gosh, we need people. We need to have a sane method to get people in this country working these jobs. And so I think that that's kind of an interesting split screen, that we have a roaring economy and a complaint about a labor shortage in the United States, and we still are are stuck in the mud on immigration reform and figuring out how to do a better job of that. And we've argued about this in every administration since I've been a journalist. I mean, 1986, they had the big Ronald Reagan had a big reform, where he said they were ending illegal immigration and they were going to supply the United States with legal workers. And since then, there's been 12 to
Immigration Reform and Control Act.
Right. Since then, there's been, 12 to, depending on whose numbers you believe, 12 to 18 million more people illegally have come into the country. So that's a big, big place where you can try to fix this.
Yeah, and the thing on the politics of that is, 2013, the Senate tried to pass comprehensive immigration reform. They had a whole bunch of Republican senators on it, but it was never taken up for a vote in the House because it would have passed as one. And you mentioned the different lobbies. I mean, from the Chamber of Commerce to ag to even, churches, everybody's for immigration reform, except for a handful of senators represent a very small amount of Americans. And we can try to, obviously point to what that's about. But comprehensive immigration reform is something that, pretty much every special interest would want. I just want to throw that in there. But I wonder,
Pete, so if we're talking about these millions of open jobs right now, and there's 800,000 in retail, there's 300,000 in warehousing, and I think there's 750,000. There's just all these open jobs. How do you get people who do not have a job right now back into those jobs? And one of the trends I've been noticing is in education and healthcare, people in their 40s and 50s who are over the past year have just dropped out. They've retired. They're done. It's been hard in education and healthcare. I'm sure do you know teachers and principals in your neck of the woods who have retired in the last year? I know several who've got 20 years or 22 years of teaching under their belt, and they're in their late 40s, and they're like, you know what? I'm out for now. Yeah. We'll see if I do something else later. But they're losing people like that in the American labor market. And I don't think they're going to go back to a job in a restaurant. You're not going to be able to fit those people in some of the jobs that are open. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunity for workers. I feel badly for small business owners who can't afford to pay $17 an hour for someone, for a part-time job. I think that the next year is going to be a year of real reckoning in the American labor force.
The on the deck barbecue conversation this summer is going to be, because we had a preview. We had 3 couples over Saturday. I don't want to brag, but the conversation everywhere now around dinner tables, just the kind of casual conversation is, so are you going into your office? I mean, what is your job? Do you go in now? And then the conversation about what your what your employer is expecting in terms of you actually returning in person. As you mentioned at the top, you've been going in, but you're the aberration. Right. Most people have not been. And then just talking about what the pros and cons of being there in person and networking and hallway talk and how all of that stuff matters. What do you think about what the pandemic created in terms of working from home and expedited these trends that a lot of experts are saying were going to happen, but they happen much faster, and just people's desire and employers' desire that you go back to work every day? What are your thoughts on that? Because everybody seems to be talking about that and having an opinion on it.
It really is. Most companies are having this soft reopening in June. We've seen that already. And then September after Labor Day, they're expecting people to come in maybe a few days a week, right? At least a few days a week. That's what I'm hearing. That's sort of the general consensus. But we heard The Verge reported yesterday about a letter to Tim Cook from Apple employees. They don't want to come back 3 days a week in September. They have worked it out for their lives and their groups that this works for them. They don't want to have to come back. I know another news organization where they did a survey in the New York office of, I think it was 250 employees, how many want to come back in September, and 2 out of 250 wanted to come back in September. So
No way.
Yeah, so I think that some companies have thought out this June-September timeframe, and they're going to start hearing from their employees that that's not going to work for them. Now, you hear from Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan Chase, or David Solomon at Goldman Sachs, and some in bankers and in media and some high tech. They say it's so important to have FaceTime to develop young workers, and that you need to be together to collaborate. So you've got these 2 competing theories here: that bosses who want to get people back so they can develop their talent, and people who are like, nope, this is working just fine for me, and plus my kids are not even in school all the time anyway.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's very interesting to see what happens. And I'm, reading about people going back to work and having social anxiety. I'm I'm in a shed every day, I would assume that you don't suffer or have any issue with that, but it is got to be weird to go back to work and see people that you haven't seen from a year. And what is that small talk? How have you been? What's going on with it's got to be weird to go back. But the other thing is the quality of people's commute, the quality of their life that that you touched on, that we've learned. So many really interesting things have changed. One more quick question for you about a really big issue, which is this idea, G7 leaders are meeting, what is it, this week? Yeah. And world leaders are meeting this week to talk about all kinds of issues, economic issues, from climate to taxes. And this idea that there's going to be kind of this global minimum tax, I find fascinating and important. It's kind of inevitable in a way that maybe it's not, that we get our act together so that, companies can't farm out their profits and their jobs and offshore everything. What's happening in a larger global trend economically that you might want to comment on?
Well, here's what I think about that. I think our John Harwood did a really great segment on this earlier this week, or I guess, yesterday. Oh my gosh, it's only Tuesday. There's a lot of work to be done on that, and you've got to get everybody on board. But the idea here is that you don't have tax havens that have a 12% tax where they can, move. Tech companies do this in Ireland, for example, move big parts of your operations there, or, park your revenue there at a lower tax rate than where you really are, right? Where you're really based. And the idea is just to make it more fair. The other thing is, the idea here is to fund the president's agenda. Corporate taxes as a share of tax revenues has been going down for 50 years. 50 years. And our share, you and me, regular people who pay taxes, all different kinds of taxes, that's been going up. So the tax burden on companies has been steadily decreasing, and they've got to just figure out a way to make it fair and make it so that companies can't just, run to the lowest number. Because technology does allow them to work around the globe, So yeah. We'll watch this space. As John Harwood was reporting, it's going to take an awful lot of work, right? Awful lot of work to make it happen.
All right. I just remember one more question. Vaccinations. How much do you think they have had an effect on economics? What do you think it will happen with, schools? Both public schools and higher education, much less employers, airlines, cruise ships, in terms of the trends for demanding a vaccine? Because we saw this Gallup polling yesterday that people have pretty much decided what they're going to do personally about the vaccine, in terms of a lot of people that say they're not going to get it, saying there's nothing you can do to convince me. However, I do think mandates are a game changer, because mostly it's been incentives, carrots, and not sticks. But what do you think is going to happen with that in terms of employment, education, et cetera, vaccines and their effect?
The vaccines have been a miracle. For sure. That we pulled this off, and by we, I mean the scientists, pulled this off in a year is just astonishing and wonderful. And it is, as I saw, maybe you saw this meme somewhere, but, vaccines are the gateway drug to normalcy. They really are. And so this is so important, and we got to get that vaccine uptake a little bit higher than it is right now. The president wants 70% by 4th of July. We got to get there. We got to do everything we can to get there. However, the mandates have become politicized, and you have got leaders, and I'll put those in air quotes, leaders who have decided that this is a culture war, that somehow wearing a mask or getting a vaccine is equivalent to, giving up your rights. And that is something that has resonated with other people. It really has this tyranny of the vaccine. And I hear it, I see it on social media all the time. And that is a problem. You saw that the Royal Caribbean actually reversed its plan to have vaccinated people only on cruises out of Florida. That's because of political pressure, of course, from the Florida governor. But if you're going to get on a cruise in Seattle to go to Alaska, you will have to be vaccinated. I know United Airlines today said that its all new employee hires from here will have to have the vaccine. A lot of universities are saying you have to have the vaccine to enroll in the fall. And guess what? There's already a student health mechanism for that, because you already have to have vaccines to go to a college campus, right? So it isn't this Orwellian overreach at all. It's something that we already do. So I think vaccines are a miracle. I think vaccine mandates in certain cases make sense, and I think it's unfortunate that it's become a wedge issue.
You know what I think? I think I've really missed talking to you. And listeners there you go, everybody. People have been demanding, where's Christine? And so there you go, everybody. And I hope to do it more often. And it's so great to hear your voice. And I love asking you questions. You're so good at this.
Thank you, Pete. Will you send me a picture, a selfie in your shed, please? I just want to see the shed.
It's funny you say that, because we're on the phone, I'm just laying back, looking up at the ceiling. I'm like, not this picture. Yes, I will. You're going to love it. It's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool lifestyle, and I'd love to talk with you more about how it's all going. I appreciate your time, as always. Thank you very much, Christine.
Bye, Pete.
Yeah, there she goes, Christine Romans. A lot of folks were excited that she was back on the show, and I was too. I always learn a lot from our conversations. Always open to interpretation. It's finance, it's economics, it's your own personal morality on such things. So there are often many different answers to a lot of the questions that I asked her. I always like to hear yours, but go say hi and thank her for joining us at Christine Romans right now. All right, my next guest, also a favorite of yours. He is a national security expert. He is former FBI, former Army. He's a national security contributor to NBC News. He's the author of Messing with the Enemy, Surviving in the Social Media World of Hackers, Terrorists, Russians, and Fake News. He's got a very popular TED Talk. He's the father of a nonverbal autistic girl who's 12 years old named Pepper, who he recently wrote about at his Substack, which is great as well. You should definitely go subscribe to Clint Watts on Substack. and he is on Twitter at Selected Wisdom. I caught up with Clint yesterday about all kinds of issues, including that Senate report that I talked earlier about, as well as ransomware, domestic terrorism, and much, much more. Here is my conversation right now with at Selected Wisdom on Twitter, my friend Clint Watts. Okay, there he is, Clint Watts. I had reached out to you last night, and then our friend Tina Winston on Twitter was like, you got to get Clint on. So it was serendipitous. I hit you there again.
You the right place.
Nailed you. Who's great on Twitter, and I already mentioned it, but follow him there at Selected Wisdom. What is this report that we're talking about and that you've been on TV all day talking about? Yeah. Why is it important, and what's wrong with it?
There's a couple things. One, it is an accounting of January 6th, and it is the Senate. Because it's the Senate, they're the only ones that really have the ability to gather all the data from the different agencies. So that's an oversight function. So that's great. You know, they're doing their function as Congress.
Why can't the House do that?
They could. You know, it's just it's sad because the House, you know, is the people's house, is what it's supposed to be, but it's kind of broken down over the last few years, really a decade. I mean, it's been a slow drips and drabs, and the Senate can organize itself. And because the senators aren't so tied to public churn, you know, they have 6-year terms, they can navigate these investigations and weather any outcome, you know, that comes from it.
The House is just so more politically divided and fragmented than the Senate. But still, it's called Examining the U.S. Capitol Attack, a review of the security planning and response failures on January 6th. Have you read this whole thing?
I read almost all of it today. There's some parts like I went through real quick because are things I know, like how the organizations are structured, stuff like that. But yeah, the findings, you know, are exactly what I kind of thought it would be. No big surprises.
So, I mean, but why is this? What's different from an investigation by the Senate versus a commission like the one that the Senate just voted against? Like, what's the difference there?
The difference is the commission was pushing for further examination into why the attack on January 6th happened. And that's where it gets super political, because obviously it's tied into politicians and elected officials who, like Josh Hawley, was pumping his fist out in front of the Capitol, and the president and many others that were speaking at the president's rally, which was what precipitated the mobilization of the Capitol as it was. So that's part of the reason why it's not a bipartisan commission the way 9/11 was. 9/11 was, yes, what happened on the attack, how did we respond? But it also investigated what were the precipitating factors and facts that led to what happened on 9/11, all the way back. You know, the history of Al-Qaeda, where did these guys come from? Where were they trained? You know, it incorporates everything of the FBI investigation up till 9/11, CIA, Intel. That on the January 6th, I think would be pretty damaging politically to a lot of folks, because the president was out in the yard telling people to walk to the Capitol. And it's interesting in this report, they did put in an appendix, basically his entire speech verbatim, which is interesting that they did that, kind of just to emphasize, like, oh, by the way, just to remind you, this is what was being said right before this happened.
But when you say that after reading it, you're not surprised by anything, you are disappointed by this report, or no?
I'm not disappointed. I mean, it's good because it cleared up some of the hearings that happened a couple months ago. If you remember, the hearings were the Capitol Police leaders, former and current, you know, went in, they all said there was no intelligence. We didn't know. And that just didn't add up to me, because you and I had talked about it before the election, right? Like, there was tons of mobilizations. The FBI didn't do anything. Then the FBI director came right out the next day and was like, well, like, we've got reporting that we sent in to you guys. And, you know, the FBI is kind of like, it's not our job to defend the Capitol. You know, you guys have to make that decision. We'll give you what we know. But then there still was a breakdown about what is the FBI and DHS allowed to observe in the open space and social media. And that's the one part that came up again in the report I was disappointed with, which is it is not settled. They don't settle it. They just say they had more authority to look at stuff in social media than they used. And you go, okay, I've been in there. I've been in that building when it comes down to talking about domestic terrorism and watching what Americans are saying in social media and what is free speech. And so basically you're asking the FBI and DHS to take in social media posts of President Trump's supporters Imagine they wrote an intel bulletin that says, here's what Trump supporters are saying about January 6th, and then whoop that around the government. It wouldn't be 30 minutes till they would be crying, spying the deep state, look at what they're doing. So I feel for, look, whether it's Trump or Biden, if you're in DHS and FBI and you've got this problem, there's no clear answers. And the report doesn't provide a clear answer. It says everyone should relook at the procedures. It's like, yeah, okay.
Well, you helped develop a lot of the curriculum. What is NJOHSP? I mean,
So years ago, New Jersey Office of Homeland Security was one of the first ones to focus on intelligence support to state and local law enforcement. And I thought that was great. And really that was, as the war on terror years worn on, like rather than Islam training, which was kind of silly, anyways, or whatever for locals, it was like how to spot an Al-Qaeda person, right? Like local police don't encounter that. They're going to find other terrorists, domestic terrorists. They're going to see criminals, right? Like that's what they do. But they did recognize the value of like preemptive intelligence. Like how can we get ahead of things so things don't get out of control or focus our small pots of resources? So they created intelligence-led policing training, which is not the sinister, like Jason Bourne kind of stuff. It's like, okay, what do we need to know? How do we find that lawfully, and legally? Can we store data? What can we look at? How would we communicate in reports out to frontline officers so they're not surprised, like on January 6th, and they know what this is? If you see this sign or these symbols, this is what it's indicative of. It's trying to be proactive. And so we actually set up a scenario in New Jersey. This is the craziest thing. And it was called Intelligence Incident Command System, ICS. You'll hear it in these briefings sometimes, which is when there's a disaster, police, law enforcement, fire will set up a command post. You'll see this a lot of times on TV. Mm-hmm. And that's where they coordinate all the actions. But there was never an intelligence function for that. So we developed a course, and it was, what would you do if the Occupy movement occupied government space and they had guns? That's what it was called. And I made up a group. You won't believe this. It's called the Forces of Freedom Coalition. That's what it was called. It was just a fictitious group. But it was the idea of if you have peaceful protesters that show up, but inside the group, you have extremists who have weapons and have a plan, and that the plan was literally to take over City Hall in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. That was the plan. And it was like, how do you deal with these rolling protests? When can you do intelligence? When are you allowed to launch an investigation? It was like teaching cops who never encounter these things. That was 8 years ago, 9 years ago. It still sits at DHS's catalog. They have it. They already paid for it. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you this until you handed me that scenario, but politically, it's always been much more acceptable to surveil folks on the left end of the political spectrum, the anti-war activists, the civil rights activists, Dr. King, and so on, in the 60s and 70s, and even during the war on terror. And, that scenario you're talking about, Occupy, again, a left-wing movement for sure. But that's also the issue is also that most in national security are on the right end of the spectrum politically. And so it's more politically acceptable, which is why it's always been fascinating to watch them be called the deep state and so on by the right and see them eat themselves. But how important is that issue? Just that idea that it's politically correct or more politically correct to to watch folks on the left than it is to watch folks on the right when the threat is overwhelmingly coming now from the right, and they are overwhelmingly those with the guns and the arms that you hypothetically talked about Occupy having.
Right. So that was the key teaching point, which is, one, how do you prepare for this when it could get violent and out of control? And that was in response to like how to handle Occupy, because they just had never really seen it before. Local police forces just didn't know what to do. But the second part was, okay, let's add the element of guys got guns. I mean, I even made one of the fictitious characters a former police officer that was fired, in the group, which is crazy. But it was like, how would you handle that, when you have these task forces? They maybe know some of the folks that are out there or their friends. And it's a super confusing thing that's very tough to teach. And I have to say, at the time, the law enforcement guys were great, in those groups. They were like very focused on it, but the president had not come along and politicized the police in that way yet. You know what I mean? Like it was still that period. I think I taught it in 2011, 12, 13, 14. This is when it still was kind of civil, and it's New Jersey. So it wasn't like trying to do it in other parts of the country. It was easier. Right. They had a very structured and well-disciplined police force in New Jersey because of the state police, which is actually Norman Schwarzkopf's dad was the first superintendent of the police in New Jersey state. I think he was the first one. But, they had a very sort of disciplined structure, and they were very professional. And I loved working with them. And it wasn't until probably actually one of the last times I taught at Pete was the day after I testified to the Senate Intel Committee. I taught it the next day, or one of those classes, like the very next day.
Wow.
Yeah. And those cops were like, "What the hell are you doing? I saw you on the news last night. What are you doing in your teaching intel policing to law enforcement?"
That was just before you got famous.
Yeah, they were just baffled. I came off Morning Joe. I still had my makeup on when I showed up there. I could see those cops looking at me. They were like, "What's that dude got makeup on for?" I battled with those brown paper towels. I was like washing my face. It was hilarious.
The worst. So zooming way out now, just on this issue before I move on to something else, where are we at right now in terms of preparation for other similar types of attacks as the one we saw on the Capitol? How concerned are you about political violence right now?
It's state to state dependent. I think it's really jurisdiction dependent. I feel in a lot of parts of the country, the steam has kind of come out of the valve and the country is opening back up. And they were bored with the Trump show, and it just was a lot of noise. And I don't know if you feel it, but it's kind of a sense of relief to a degree to just not hear the banter, nonstop all the time.
Yeah.
In other parts, I think it's small pockets. There's still a lot of trouble, on the horizon. And I am remarkable. I have a West Point friend, Colleyville, Texas is one of these towns. They have a lot of the insurrectionists in and around that area, have been arrested. They have a Texas separatist group, Facebook groups. That worries me a lot because that's small enclaves, small collectives. So in the grand scheme of things, it's the 1%, but it's the 1% that are tightly wound both online and on the ground. I think there are pockets like we saw in Arizona with this voting fiasco recount thing, right? Some of this is bonkers. And so that still worries me.
Yeah, I think that's a good nuanced way of looking at it for sure. And how important is it that, I don't know, I can't keep track of how many, but over 400 of the insurrectionists have been arrested and penalized. I feel like there being consequences for that type of crime is super important. And it's kind of, we can talk about how there should be much more done in terms of investigation. We can talk about the penalties. We can talk about the individual different acts, but I feel like that matters a lot, that they've been arrested. These people that were kind of living, quote, normal lives. Most of them were doing pretty well. And all of a sudden their friends here, did you hear dude was at the Capitol? He got arrested. Really? Dave from accounting? Yeah. I think that matters.
It matters a lot. It is. I believe that regardless of your support for or against President Trump, 90% of Americans were horrified about what they saw on TV that day. They do not believe the conspiracies, even if they say they do, that it was some false flag or some other nonsense like that. And watching people get prosecuted, watching them plea that, there's a guy today, I saw it was a AP story. He believed the big lie and now he knows it's not true and he's very sorry. Yeah, those sorts of things have a dampening effect, over time where you start to go, yep, okay, you ruined your life. One of the guys, that was like bashing a shield into the window, like, oh, this affected my business. I'm like, yeah, man, of course it did. Like, how could you be shocked at all? You are on not national, international television, smashing cops and breaking in the Capitol on January 6th. Yeah, business is going to go down, buddy. This is ridiculous. It's just ridiculous.
I have said this before, though, but a lot on this podcast. I have sympathy for people who believe the big lie.
Yeah, and having studied social media and like psychology of influence and those sorts of things, look, if you just inundate yourself all day long with crazy talk, you will start to believe it. And so I do feel for him somewhat, but I what I feel sorry for him now about is that the people that are supposedly their elected leaders are continuing the nonsense story, right? Like they continue the elections. That's what's most disappointing, I think, in the end.
Disappointing is an understatement.
Yeah.
Just horrifying. Just horrifying.
Kind of treasonous, actually, or secessionist, depending on what your angle is on it.
For sure. I mean, no doubt about it. Hard to know where it goes. With the noise not being there all day with Trump, you have to wonder who picks up the baton and why it continues. Do you think that the big lie dies in any way, or will it just continue on? What are you seeing?
I think there's a couple things to consider. One, it's generational, right? You don't see a lot of young people out amping the big lie. I mean, it's mostly older folks on Facebook, that are part of Trump's circle. And that will die because they will hear it less. And I think there's a couple studies that just came out about the effects of Trump being off Twitter and how much conspiracies have gone down, and a lot of this. And that's correct, based on my assessment. I think the other thing is, once people realize that Trump will not run again for office, or that somebody can win as a Republican without being loyal to Trump, that will crack the facade of like what's holding a lot of this together. And I imagine McConnell, because he's a very smart player in terms of politics like this, will figure out how to crack that over time.
I'm loving your Substack, clintwatts.substack.com, and I've linked it to the show notes. But I haven't talked to you since you posted this really important piece about your daughter, who you also wrote about in your book and who you talk about a lot. It's titled, "I've not spoken with my daughter in 12 years. I hope she's okay during the pandemic." Why haven't you seen or spoken to your daughter? If you didn't know about your daughter, it's like, Jesus, what a shitty day.
If I've learned anything, she doesn't like me.
What a shitty father hasn't talked to his daughter in 12 years. Get over it.
Yeah, I did it to her. That's it. I was like, I don't want to talk to you. No, she has severe autism and she's nonverbal. And so I talk to her all the time. And she does make noises and she verbalizes in some ways. So we just can't have conversations. But yeah, the focus of the article was just kind of the enduring, trying to figure out, does she understand why she hasn't been to school most of a year? I think she went about 30 to 35 days, that year. And the struggle with vaccines, even amongst some of the anti-vaxxers and faculty and staff not wanting to get it, which would then shut down the school. Very confusing. And, that is massively devastating for families with special needs kids, not just my daughter Pepper, but, if you are a single parent with a child with autism or handicapped over the last year and you are working, I don't know how you would have made it. I cannot imagine how you would have made it. You wouldn't have been able to pay for childcare. There was no childcare available anyways. There is no school. They can't wear masks. You can't go into stores. There are no public restrooms. You can't go in public restrooms. We had a good network of support, but it still was, it's one of the toughest years, in my life. Probably that year and the year I found out she was diagnosed with autism and like trying to figure out what that new world would be like. Those 2 years have been the toughest.
It's a really great piece. I'm so glad that you wrote it. And I think it's very important for any parent to read other parents talking about that. What is the phrase? Non-normative? I don't know.
Yes.
Kids, because it provides so much perspective, I think, to understand what you're dealing with and also why it matters that we get vaccinated. And that's the point that you pivot to. Get vaccinated. And then you've got, other pieces and talking about social media and conspiracies and so on. And now we have some new data about, I don't know if you saw the Gallup poll, if you've written about it, but about, those remaining who haven't gotten vaccinated and why they won't and what it'll change. So make the pitch as to why it's so important for people to get vaccinated. And this coming from, obviously, the father of a daughter who has autism and that whole horrific conspiracy that started all of the damage about vaccines causing autism years ago, because you make this pitch really well in this piece and subsequent pieces and tweets.
Well, it's interesting in the American way. It was always the idea that we're in this together, regardless of race, religion, economic status, right? And so there's a fascinating picture I saw from the pandemic where they opened it up to sports events and everybody has a mask on in the whole stadium so they could still function. And that's no vaccines, right? This is Spanish flu. and you rewind or you fast forward 100 years and you're like, wow, our doctors figured out a vaccine and deployed it in less than a year, and it works, and it changed our whole life. Think the last time I talked to you to now, 90 days. New York has changed dramatically.
Yeah, you and I got vaccinated, and I think on the same day. I was reading beginning of April.
And so just to think about the speed of that, and that we can solve this, and we're not. And that's, there's Tocqueville is this guy, who went around the U.S. in the 1800s, and he talked about the tyranny of the majority versus the tyranny of the minority, right? And like the idea that one person won't get vaccinated actually outweighs what the other 99 might, because of the way it can continue to spread the pandemic. And so one person bringing COVID into my daughter's school or into a hospital or into a medical facility or a new variant that crops up shuts down all of our lives. It's the tyranny of an extreme minority. Yeah. And it really shows how our nation is not in this together, which is just fascinating that the greatest country in the world, right? We have everything at our fingertips, all of this. And yet all we got to do is get 2 shots in the arm and we can really get back to normal. And we're saying no for reasons that don't quite make any sense.
It was easier to be unified when we were told just 3 or 4 stories, or we're unified around, an enemy that we all kind of agreed upon mostly. But now we're so fragmented and have so many different beliefs that it's hard for folks to come together, except around maybe a sporting event like that, or having to go to school. I say mandate the vaccines for that. But let me just ask you one last question, which I think is really important to talk about. You've been talking about this. Help me understand these ransomware attacks. And are there a lot more of those happening than are being reported? Basically, let me try to explain it. But a hacker comes in and shuts down your website, shuts down your company, and says, all you got to do is pay me $20,000. They actually estimate, I'm told in some cases, the ransom as to what they think you can afford, your town, the state, or the company to some extent. Who are these people? Has any been prosecuted successfully? And to the first question, are there a lot more of these that are happening, and what's the outlook? Those are 17 questions, Clint.
So let's start scale. There were lots and lots of ransomware attacks, maybe, 7 years ago even. I was working in cybersecurity, but they were targeting mostly individuals. So people like you and I going after their computers, pay a small amount of ransom, $100, Bitcoin, something like that, and you get your computer back, or you didn't because you're small, and you report it into the government and they go, that's terrible. Thanks for letting us know. Right. So what happened is criminals realized, like, you know what, if we scale this like a business rather than just going after everybody, and we start thinking about the targets and how much value they have in their business, then we can estimate, is it cheaper for them to pay us a ransom or for them to shut down their whole system and rebuild it? So they started going after the weakest links in the cybersecurity space. And that was predominantly state and local governments. Baltimore, by the way, was one city that just got completely wiped out by one of these scams, this ransomware scam. They started going after hospitals because hospitals would immediately cave because they need to get their things back online. And there's some horrific examples from the United Kingdom, where this happened. And so then they just kept upping their game. And the more they upped the game, the more they became like a smart business. Like, okay, let's do our business analysis. Who should we be targeting? But the problem is coming from overseas. And yes, it comes from lots of places overseas, but one place more than others, and that's Russia. There's kind of a de facto rule in Russia. You can hack anywhere, just don't hack at home. And some of the code is actually made to look at a person's system. And if they speak Russian, it doesn't attack their system. Like that's how they plan it to make sure they don't accidentally hit people that might be inside Russia, which would cause a backlash of Putin. The other part for Putin in Russia is having the cyber criminal underground means that at any given time, you can pivot to that cyber criminal underground. They can work for you. And so this is where we're at the standoff right now, why the summit is such a big deal, because the last two, Colonial Pipeline and JBS, the meat packing, both are believed to come from ransomware in Russia. And that's why the Biden-Putin summit next week is going to be such a big deal.
I don't want to simplify it, but can't the American government, in this case, the Biden administration, say, if you don't stop, we're going to retaliate with similar ransomware or some other kind of cyber attack to shut down? Because this idea, I hear a lot of reporters and certainly politicians, even I think the president himself saying, well, it's not the Russian government, but it is coming from Russia. And then I hear from Russian experts that say, no, it's always the Russian government with the approval of the Russian government. So
what do we do? How do we stop the Russians? Is there anything that we can do?
So in short, I think those excuses suck, Pete. And I was writing an article about these are sucky excuses because I've heard them since 2009. I remember ransomware and some of these attacks coming from overseas. It was like 2009. I was working down in DC and I was like, and I just accepted the reasoning, right? Which is always that we've got more vulnerabilities because we're bigger and it can shut down our economy. And so like we need to just manage it. We'll improve our systems. Okay, that's been 12 years. And the answer was always, well, we'll start taking losses. They'll start knocking out our infrastructure. I'm like, well, that just happened every single week now for like a month. Like clearly it's happening. Like, why would we wait? And they're like, oh, it could be worse. They could shut down the internet. I'm like, if they shut down the internet, then they can't get paid. So like, let's rationally like think this back through, right? The whole world would freak out. Like China would turn on Russia because the internet is the backbone of the economy. These arguments don't make sense to me. So, I brought it up last week on Nicole Wallace on the show on Friday, and people were like, "You're crazy. You're nuts. You can't attack back." And I'm like, look, deterrence is two parts. Yes, we need to defend ourselves better, but we've been trying that for a decade and it hasn't worked. You got to go in there and start throwing some punches in some way. And it doesn't mean like destroying Russia's internet, but you have to set some sort of boundary and push back so that the benefits don't, always outweigh the cost for these guys, which they do right now.
Why can't our foreign policy and diplomacy be like an episode of Madam Secretary?
Lots of reasons.
Have you ever watched that show?
One is Capitol Hill. Two is the way spending kind of works in the government space. And three, I do think you just can't survive in government long enough to implement your changes over time.
That's a great answer to a question I was like joking about, but that's a really good answer. But just on that last point, you can't survive in government to implement your idea. What do you mean? Just real quick, Clint, on it.
So
what do you mean by that?
If you looked across DHS, I don't know what it is now, but at one point the average time at DHS was 2 years or less. Man, and every appointee does the same thing. Look, I need to take 6 months to get my hands around this, and then 6 months to sell my plan. Right? Like I should film a 30-second YouTube of a career in government, right? And then at the end of the 1 year, they go, my plan is this, and they do a speaking tour, and then they start to like implement things that are usually good ideas, Republican or Democrat. There's great people like all the way across the board. Chris Krebs, fantastic, but he was there 2 years and then he got fired, right? And a lot of the folks at DHS, they're just in and out. Only the FBI director stays 10 years, and that's why Mueller was able to change the FBI after 9/11. He was there like 12 years, 13 years, one of the longest tours. He could outweather administrations and spending changes to keep the organization like focused. DOD does better with it because they do officers and rotations that come back to the same jobs and have specialty fields. So they do better, which is why we get drones in with weapons in Pakistan, like in 3 years, right? Like, but that's because of that giant hulking bureaucracy. The rest of the U.S. government, no way. Health and Human Services, climate, I mean, pick any of these things.
Yeah, you don't know. I think I'm lucky to have a few people that I know that work in the federal government that I can talk to off the record that can tell me how that works. But I think most people don't understand the point you're making about how fast things change and how hard it is to implement any kind of policy because you're there for such a short time. If you don't work in the federal government or know people do and have honest conversations, you don't hear that very much. So I'm glad you brought that point up. I mean, the one friend I talked to the most is in Interior, and the changes between Trump and or Obama to Trump and Trump to Biden, just night and day, overnight, too, in terms of the policies, the new ideas and objectives. So that's Interior.
Yeah. And the bureaucratic inertia. There's a lot of bureaucrats in the government who know this appointee, 18 months.
Yep. Look at their watch.
Wait them out. Just send those emails slower, right? Like those files are hard to find, boss. I'll be there. We better put that meeting off till after Christmas. Oh, spending freeze, a government shutdown, 3 weeks, they know how to, suddenly you don't have much time as a leader to implement much change at all. And you have to mobilize a lot of, people who are averse to change.
We can talk about solutions to that, but that'll take longer. I appreciate your time, man. As always, so great talking to you and love reading the Substack. You're doing great work as always. Clint, thank you.
Thanks, Pete.
Stand
Yeah, go tell him that you heard him right here on Stand Up, because that always matters, and I appreciate those of you who do it. Clint Watts, so good. Always great. Lots of questions, lots of answers, and would love to hear what you think about that. And as well as Christine Romans, the return of Romans. Had a great conversation with her after off the air, too. She's such a, I think, underappreciated person over there at CNN, only because she doesn't try to make it about her and make herself a big star. She just does the work and treats everybody so well. And I have great admiration for both of my guests today and for you. Thanks very much for supporting me and listening to the show, and tell your friends. Shout out to Chris Metka, who's been a long-time listener, subscriber. I gave him a call for the first time yesterday. We talked all about our lives and the show, and he was very generous and has been a great supporter. So, Chris, thank you. Alec Peters, had a great conversation with him as well, and I'd love to talk with you. So reach out anytime. standupwithpete@gmail.com, everybody, and I will talk to you tomorrow on Stand Up with Pete Dominic Daily, and hopefully I'll see you tonight at the Hangout. That's tonight, 8 p.m. If you're a subscriber, you get the link, and you meet us at 8 p.m. tonight. Always a lot of fun. Hope to see you there. All right, that's it. I love you. Hang out on the Discord platform anytime if you're a subscriber, because you're never alone. You can always chat over there. And I will talk to you tomorrow right here on Stand Up. Take it away, John Carroll.
Red and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in. With other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? Cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run there.